went down with the French press, but it's also getting coverage in other newspapers around the world.
Yes, it's one of the first times the French presidential campaign has started to pick up a lot of newspaper coverage around the world, especially in Britain. Now, in here, in The Guardian, they're pretty excited. They say he's put aside the image of being Mr. Marshmallow, as he was once called by his party, and he's put aside that sort of jovial sweetness and has got an Obama-style hope and change campaign message, which they reckon he really sold to the socialist faithful yesterday. Their correspondent says you can see he's the man with the conviction that he can beat Nicolas Sarkozy. He's got that strength now to go up against him. So they're very positive. In, of course, the rather left-leaning Guardian, they say that his sort of personal image that he's selling of how simple and ordinary he is will work for the French people compared to the bling-bling image of that Sarkozy had. But in the rather more right-leaning Times, they're a bit scared by his attacks on bankers yesterday. Inside here, there's a piece headlined French presidential front-runner attacks, or declares war, actually, on France's rich. Now, they say, of course, that attack on the financial industry yesterday shows that he's gone too far left for their liking, and that if he's elected president, he might not be the kind of president that Britain, and certainly not a British Tory government, would want to deal with if he's going to attack the bankers like that. They also stress the amount of division that there remains within the French left, attacks that he's had from people like Jean-Luc Mélenchon, the left-leaning candidate who likened him to the captain of a pedalo recently, and they definitely don't think that he's done what needs to be done so far to unite the French left in the Times.
Now, also in the headlines this morning, Yemen with the departure of President Saleh for the US. What are the papers making of that then?
Well, let's have a look at the Abu Dhabi-based English-language paper Gulf News. They say that, of course, there's been a lot of calls in Yemen, for a lot of opposition, rather, in Yemen to the deal to give Saleh presidential immunity. But they say in an editorial today that Yemen has got to look beyond that, that people in Yemen have risked a lot, they've sacrificed a lot to force him out in protests and demonstrations, and that now they need to concentrate on building a new democracy and not worrying about whether or not Saleh can ever be brought to justice. Another English-language paper in the region, The National, says in their editorial today that actually retributive justice for former dictators is a waste of time. It doesn't necessarily help the project of building a new country. They think, anyway, that trials like Hosni Mubarak's that's going on at the moment in Egypt are basically a distracting waste of time. They allow the new government to pin the blame for what happened in the past onto one person, and so actually they stop those sort of mistakes being cleared out of the system as a whole.
Speaking of Egypt, the new parliament there sits for the first time today, and on Wednesday it'll be a year since Hosni Mubarak was ousted in an uprising, and the papers are reflecting on a very eventful year for Egypt.
Well, exactly. There's lots of articles in the Egyptian press today looking back over the course of the whole year. The Harvard history professor, Robert Owen, who's written a piece for Al-Masri Al-Yum today, and he says we should remember that the process of creating a democracy is slow and complicated, and we shouldn't be too disheartened at the moment by the slow pace of change, what many see as the slow pace of change, what protesters in Egypt are worried about the regime there being, taking up some of the colours of Mubarak's old totalitarian regime. They say, of course, all the different parties in that new assembly are going to be fighting for their own interest when they try and write Egypt's new constitution. We should remember Rome wasn't built in a day, and the fact that this process is even going on is really heartening.
Now, in the US, there was a surprise win in the South Carolina primary at the weekend, with Newt Gingrich getting the most votes. What are the papers making of that then?
Well, they're all sort of setting out to explain exactly how that happened in today's US papers. The New York Times says that basically all bets are off now. The Republican primary, according to them, always used to be a sort of decision made by the elite of the party where they would pick out the candidate who looked the most electable for the country as a whole. But now, in the advent of 24-hour TV news channels, and that's just no longer the case. It's more the candidate that Fox News picks that's going to do well, and it's personality that matters, according to the New York Times. So whereas over in the Daily Beast, they're having a look at what they call the hypocrisy of right-wing Republican voters who, of course, are strongly against things like abortion and gay marriage. Their moral issues supposedly are very important to them, and yet they picked a man who's been married 3 times and famously cheated on 2 of his wives. Now, they explain that. Why is Romney's having once supported abortion years ago somehow a worse moral sin to them than Gingrich's troubled love life? But they say that it's not so much the candidates' principles and what they've done in their lives that matters. It's just had the charm and passion that they can bring across on TV and in those debates that matters to the Republican voters.
All right, thanks very much, Elena, for that look at the international newspapers. You're watching live from Paris. Still to come, the flamboyant founder of file-sharing site Mega Upload in mega trouble as the US takes revenge on what it calls online piracy. More in business right after the break.